What is the exact dollar amount required to turn a man's loyalty into a weapon? You think you know the answer, but you don't. You think about greed, about fancy cars and diamond watches, but those are just toys for children. Real betrayal doesn't come from greed. It comes from desperation. Before I owned this city, before I was flying 98% pure blue magic in the false bottoms of servicemen's caskets from Vietnam, I learned everything I know about power from one man, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. And the most important lesson he ever taught me wasn't about how to kill a man. It was about how to let him live just long enough to wish he was dead. It was March 17th, 1963. 7:23 in the morning. I was standing in the foyer of the brownstone on 127th Street, adjusting my tie, watching the kitchen through the crack in the door. The air smelled like old wood polish and fresh percolation. Roosevelt Clemens, we called him Rosie, was at the stove. For 8 years, that man had been a fixture in Bumpy's life. He cooked the meals, ironed the shirts, and kept the secrets. He was supposed to be family. But that morning, I saw something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Rosie's hands weren't shaking. See, for nearly a decade, Rosie had a tremor. A little rattle in the wrist, the mark of a man who worked too hard and carried too much. But today, his hands were surgical. Steady. Cold. That's the tell. When a man finally decides to cross the line, the fear disappears, replaced by a terrible, quiet purpose. He was holding a porcelain cup, and inside that cup was a contract from the Genovese family worth $15,000. $15,000. That was the price Carmine Persico put on Bumpy Johnson's head. They didn't send a hitman with a shotgun. They sent a check to a desperate father with a sick daughter. Rosie's little girl, Lucille, needed heart surgery at Johns Hopkins. The Italians knew that. They knew that love is a more efficient killer than hate. So they gave Rosie the arsenic. Odorless. Tasteless. A slow accumulation over 2 weeks that would look like a heart attack. Rosie poured the coffee. The steam rose up like a ghost. He had added the final dose that morning, enough to cap off 16 days of slow poisoning. I watched Bumpy walk into the kitchen at 7:24 sharp. He was wearing his gray slacks and white undershirt, reading glasses perched on his forehead. He sat down with the weight of a mountain settling into the earth. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Rosie. He just looked at the cup. Rosie placed it in front of him. I stopped breathing. Bumpy lifted the cup. He took a sip, then another. He swallowed it down with the same methodical rhythm he used to run Harlem. I was waiting for the gasp, the clutch of the chest, the sudden collapse of the empire. But nothing happened. The world didn't stop. Bumpy just set the empty cup back on the saucer, the china clicking against the china, a sound loud as a gunshot in that silent kitchen. He looked up at Rosie, and he smiled. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You make it stronger today, Rosie," Bumpy said. Rosie's throat bobbed. "Just the usual, Mr. Johnson." Bumpy held out the cup for a refill, and that's when I saw it. The tremor was back. Rosie's hand was vibrating so hard the pot rattled against the rim. He poured the second cup, terrified, confused, wondering why the man across from him wasn't dying. Then Bumpy said 7 words that froze the blood in my veins. "Sylvia's. This afternoon. Bring the pot." He knew. Bumpy didn't just suspect. He knew everything. He knew about the money, the Italians, the girl, and the poison. He had known for 16 days, and in that moment, I realized that Bumpy wasn't just surviving. He was orchestrating a masterpiece. The garden always knows the snake. You have to understand what Harlem was before I fixed it. It was a plantation. That's the only word for it. From 110th Street to 155th, you had 500,000 people living on top of each other, sweating, striving, dying, and spending every dime they had. But who owned the register? Who emptied the till at the end of the night? Not us. We were just the labor. We were sharecroppers on the pavement. The hierarchy was clear, rigid, and insulting. At the bottom were the junkies, the walking dead scratching at their own skin. Above them were the street dealers, the corner boys hustling for crumbs. Above them were the lieutenants, men like me in the early days, driving the Cadillacs and wearing the alpaca coats, thinking we were kings because we had a pocket full of cash. But we weren't kings. We were managers. We reported to the Italians. That was the ceiling. The Five families, the Gambinos, the Lucchese's, the Genoveses. They sat in their social clubs in Pleasant Avenue or Little Italy, drinking espresso and laughing at us. They controlled the supply. If you wanted a kilo of heroin in Harlem, you had to buy it from a fat man named Sal or Vinny who had never set foot north of Central Park. And that brings me to the problem that defined my life, the cancer that was eating our business alive. The middlemen. A middleman is a parasite. He doesn't create anything. He doesn't transport anything. He doesn't take the risk. He just stands in the middle with his hand out. The Italians were the ultimate middlemen. They would bring the product in from the French connection in Marseille, but by the time it got to us, it had been stepped on more times than a cigarette butt in Times Square. Let me give you the math, because business is just math with consequences. The Italians would buy a kilo for $4,000 or $5,000. They would cut it with milk sugar, quinine, baby powder, whatever white trash they could find. They would turn 1 kilo into 4. Then they would sell those diluted garbage kilos to the black man for $35,000 apiece. Do you see the insult? They were selling us poison at a 600% markup, and we were thanking them for the privilege. It was bad product, bad economics, and bad for the soul. I looked at this system, and I didn't see power. I saw inefficiency. I saw a supply chain that was broken. I realized that if I wanted to be a king, I couldn't just climb the ladder. I had to burn the ladder down and build an elevator. I had to cut out the middlemen. I had to go to the source. While the rest of the country looked at Vietnam and saw war, I saw a market. I saw a direct line to the Golden Triangle, where the poppy fields stretched out like endless white sheets. I saw a way to bypass Marseille, bypass the mob, and bypass the disrespect. To show you what that looks like, I'll tell you about the 3 moments where the balance of power shifted. 3 moments where Harlem stopped being a colony and started being an empire. The first example was the product itself. Before me, the average bag of dope on 116th Street was maybe 10% purity, if you were lucky. Junkies were shooting up mostly baking soda and hope. When I brought in my first shipment of Blue Magic, directly from the source in Southeast Asia, it was 98% pure. I didn't touch it. I didn't cut it. I didn't step on it. I put it out on the street, just like it came out of the jungle. I remember the first day we dropped it. I gave it to the distributors on 116th and 8th Avenue. I told them to warn the customers, this isn't the Italian trash. This is the real thing. Use half. Of course, junkies don't listen. They doubled down. That afternoon, we had 4 overdoses on 1 block. The ambulances were screaming. The police were swarming. My lieutenants were panicked, terrified that the heat would shut us down. They wanted to pull the product. I told them no. You don't pull the product, you brand it. In this business, an overdose isn't a tragedy, it's an advertisement. It tells the consumer that the product is strong. By that evening, the line for Blue Magic wrapped around the block. We weren't selling drugs anymore. We were selling the best brand in New York City. The Italians were selling a Ford Pinto with a broken engine, and I was selling a Rolls-Royce for the same price. That isn't gangsterism. That's American capitalism. The second example was the pricing structure. The Italians tried to squeeze me. A capo from the Lucchese family, a guy named Dominic, called a sit-down. He heard I was moving weight, and he came to collect his tax. He sat across from me in a diner in Jersey, eating a cannoli, looking at me like I was something he scraped off his shoe. He told me I owed him 20% of every kilo I moved because I was operating in their territory. I looked him in the eye, and I asked him a simple question. I asked him if he knew what the humidity was in Bangkok in July. I asked him if he knew how to navigate a riverboat up the Mekong Delta while getting shot at by the Viet Cong. I asked him if he knew the name of the general who signed the export papers in the jungle. He stared at me, mouth open, crumbs on his lip. He didn't know. Of course he didn't know. I told him, if you don't carry the box, you don't get paid for the delivery. I don't pay for air, Dominic, and I don't pay taxes to people who can't find Vietnam on a map. I walked out of that diner, and I didn't leave an envelope. That was the moment they knew. We weren't working for them anymore. We were competing with them, and we were winning. The third example was the law. In the old hierarchy, you ran from the police. You hid. You paid off a beat cop here and there to look the other way. That's small thinking. When you have the kind of money I was making, $1 million a day when the pipeline was full, you don't hide from the law. You buy it. I didn't just pay off beat cops. I bought the Special Investigations Unit, the SIU, the Elite Squad. These were the guys who were supposed to take me down, and they were on my payroll. I had detectives carrying my money to the bank because it was safer than an armored truck. I had a sergeant who would call me if a raid was scheduled, not to warn me to run, but to ask if I wanted them to hit my competition instead. One night, I was at a club on 125th, wearing a chinchilla coat and a $50,000 watch. 2 detectives walked in. The room went silent. Everyone expected the cuffs. Instead, the detectives walked up to my table, shook my hand, and thanked me for the Christmas bonus I sent their wives. They stood guard by the door while I finished my drink. That is power. Power isn't a gun. Power is walking into a room and having the people who are supposed to hunt you act as your security detail. Bumpy Johnson taught me how to be a man, how to have dignity, how to spot a snake in the garden, but he was playing a local game. He was the King of Harlem, but he was still locked inside the castle walls. I looked at the map and realized the castle was too small. I didn't want to be the King of Harlem. I wanted to be the chairman of the board, and to do that, I needed an army. Not street thugs, not loudness, not flash. I needed family. I needed people who knew the smell of hog pens and tobacco fields. People who knew what it meant to have nothing, so they would protect everything. The Italians had their omertà. They had their blood oaths. I had something stronger. I had the country boys. And that is where the real takeover began. You think you understand loyalty because you've seen it in the movies. You think loyalty is a blood oath or a kiss on the ring. But in my world, loyalty is nothing but a line on a balance sheet. It is an asset that depreciates the moment desperation walks in the room. And nobody, I don't care who you are, is immune to the mathematics of desperation. I brought my brothers up from North Carolina, the country boys, because I thought blood was the only thing that couldn't be bought. I thought if a man grew up sleeping in the same dirt as you, he wouldn't sell you out. But Bumpy Johnson taught me that even blood has a price tag. You just have to find the right currency. For some men, it's greed. For others, it's fear. But for the most dangerous kind of traitor, the currency is love. Let me take you back to that February night. The night the conspiracy started. I wasn't in the car, but I know every word that was said, every breath that was taken, because in Harlem, the pavement records everything. It was cold, the kind of New York cold that cracks the skin on your knuckles. Roosevelt Clemens, Rosie, was standing outside a pharmacy on 135th Street. He was holding a small paper bag with heart medication for his daughter, Lucille. He was shivering, not just from the wind, but from the terror of watching his child die by inches. Lucille was 17, born with a heart that beat like a broken clock. She needed surgery at Johns Hopkins. $12,000 for the doctors, $3,000 for the hospital. 15 grand. To a man like me, 15 grand is pocket change. It's a night out. It's a spilled drink. But to a cook earning a salary, 15 grand is the distance between here and the moon. Rosie had 2,000 in a coffee can under his mattress. He was 13,000 short, and time was running out. A black Cadillac pulled up to the curb. It didn't look like a car. It looked like a shark swimming through gray water. The window rolled down. The heat from the inside spilled out, smelling of expensive leather and stale cigar smoke. Danny Mancuso was inside. Danny was a soldier for the Genovese family. He was a middleman, a courier of bad news and dirty money. He wore a sharkskin suit that cost more than Rosie made in a year. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that makes you check for your wallet. "Get in, Rosie. It's cold out there." Rosie got in. That was his first mistake. You never get in the car. Once the door closes, the world outside disappears, and the only reality left is the one the devil is offering you. Danny didn't waste time. He didn't ask about the weather. He put a thick white envelope on the dashboard. It sat there, heavy and quiet. "We know about Lucille, Rosie. We know about the heart valve. We know you're a good father." A good father would do anything to save his little girl, wouldn't he? Rosie stared at the envelope. He knew what it was. It was life. It was breath for his daughter. "What do I have to do?" Rosie asked. His voice was small, cracked. Danny reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial. No label, just clear liquid. "Arsenic," Danny said. "It's clean. It's quiet. 2 weeks, Rosie. A few drops in the morning coffee, a few drops in the evening tea. It builds up. It looks like natural causes. Bumpy is an old man. Old hearts give out. By the time they put him in the ground, you'll be in Baltimore, watching your daughter wake up with a brand new life." Rosie looked at the vial. Then he looked at the money. He wasn't seeing Bumpy Johnson, the man who had employed him for 8 years. He wasn't seeing the man who gave him a home. He was seeing his daughter in a coffin. "I'll do it," Rosie whispered. And just like that, an 8-year bond was severed by a $15,000 knife. Now here is the part the Italians never understood. They thought because they had money, they had power. They thought because they could buy a man's desperation, they owned the board. But they forgot one thing. They were tourists. We lived here. The Genovese family didn't know about Samuel Vine. Samuel was the pharmacist on 138th Street, a quiet man, wore thick glasses. He filled prescriptions for half the neighborhood. He also owed Bumpy a favor from 1954 when we stopped a local gang from torching his store. 2 days before Rosie got into the Cadillac, he had gone to Samuel. He asked about rat poison. He asked specifically about arsenic. He was nervous, sweating. Samuel told him he didn't carry it, but he remembered the look in Rosie's eyes. When the Italians bought the arsenic from a contact in the Bronx, that contact had a cousin who ran numbers for us. The information traveled. It moved from the Bronx to a stoop on 116th, to a waitress at a diner, to my lieutenant, and finally, to the brownstone. The network, my friends, is faster than the telephone. By the time Rosie poured the first cup of poisoned coffee, Bumpy Johnson already knew the chemical composition of the liquid, the serial numbers on the bills in the envelope, and the name of the surgeon in Baltimore. I wanted to kill Rosie immediately. I told Bumpy, "Let me take him to the basement. I'll make him disappear. We send his head to the Genovese Social Club in a hatbox." Bumpy looked at me like I was a child who had just learned a curse word. "Frank," he said, sitting in his leather chair, cleaning his glasses, "you kill a man, you silence him, but you don't teach anyone anything. Dead men don't carry messages." "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to watch him," Bumpy said. "For 16 days we watched a man disintegrate. It was the most brutal thing I have ever seen." Juno Brown, Bumpy's right hand, had gone out and bought 2 identical percolators. Every morning before Rosie arrived at 6, Juno would brew a fresh, clean pot of coffee and hide the poisoned one. Rosie would come in, his hands shaking, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He would pour the coffee. He thought he was killing the man he respected most in the world. He would serve it to Bumpy, and Bumpy would drink it, smile, and ask for another cup. Can you imagine the terror? Rosie is waiting for the cough, the choke, the death rattle. And every day, Bumpy looks stronger. Every day, Bumpy asks him about his daughter. "How's Lucille, Rosie? She looking pale? You should take some time off. Spend it with her. It was psychological warfare. Bumpy was tearing Rosie's mind apart, piece by piece, without ever raising his voice. He was letting the guilt do the work of a bullet. By the 16th day, Rosie was a ghost. He had lost 10 pounds. His skin was gray. He jumped at the sound of a closing door. He was a man being eaten alive from the inside out. That brings us to the Sunday brunch at Sylvia's. March 17th. Sylvia's was the Vatican of Harlem. If you were anybody, you were there on Sunday after church. The air was thick with the smell of fried chicken, collard greens, and expensive perfume. We had 85 people in that room. Politicians, judges, numbers runners, hustlers, the whole ecosystem. Bumpy sat at the center table. He looked like a king holding court. I stood by the wall watching the door, my hand resting near the .38 under my jacket. I saw Rosie come out of the kitchen. He was carrying the silver coffee pot. He looked like he was walking to the gallows. Bumpy stood up and tapped his glass with a spoon. The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop on the carpet. Ladies and gentlemen, Bumpy said, his voice booming. We talk a lot about business in this room. We talk about power. But today, I want to talk about family. He gestured to Rosie. This man, Roosevelt Clemens, has fed me for 8 years. He knows how I like my eggs. He knows how I take my coffee. He is the first face I see in the morning, and the last face I see at night. The crowd clapped politely. Rosie looked like he was going to vomit. He was gripping the handle of that coffee pot so hard his knuckles were white. Bumpy smiled. A cold, reptilian smile. Rosie, bring that pot over here. Rosie walked to the table. His legs were shaking. Pour me a cup, Bumpy said. Rosie poured. The dark liquid swirled in the china cup. Steam rose up. Bumpy picked up the cup. He held it up to the light. Then he set it down across the table, in front of an empty chair. Sit down, Rosie. Rosie froze. I said sit down. Rosie sat. He looked small in the chair, like a child who had been caught stealing. Bumpy leaned in close. The whole room was watching. They didn't know what was happening, but they felt the temperature drop. They knew something was wrong. You made this coffee yourself, didn't you, Rosie? Fresh pot. Just for me. Yes, Mr. Johnson, Rosie whispered. Then you shouldn't have any problem drinking it. The silence in that room was heavy enough to crush a man. Rosie stared at the cup. He knew what was in there. He had put the drops in himself. 16 days of arsenic. Concentrated death. Bumpy's voice didn't rise. It just got harder. Drink it. Rosie looked at the crowd. He looked at me. He looked at Bumpy. He realized there was no way out. If he refused, he confessed. If he drank, he died. He lifted the cup. His hand was trembling so bad the coffee splashed onto the white tablecloth. It looked like a bloodstain. He brought the cup to his lips. He closed his eyes. And he drank. He swallowed the whole cup. He set it down, bracing himself for the fire in his gut, waiting for his throat to close up. He sat there, eyes squeezed shut, waiting to die. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Rosie opened his eyes. He was still breathing. He touched his chest. He looked at Bumpy, confusion washing over his panic. Bumpy reached across the table and poured him another cup. Drink another one, Rosie. Rosie drank. Again. And again. He drank until the pot was empty. He sat there, alive, bewildered, tears streaming down his face. Bumpy stood up. He looked down at Rosie with a mixture of pity and disgust. It's bitters, Rosie. Just bitters. Rosie looked up, gasping. I switched the pots 3 weeks ago, Bumpy said. I've been drinking your poison for 16 days, but it never left the kitchen sink. Rosie broke. He put his head in his hands and sobbed. It was an ugly sound, a sound of total defeat. My daughter, he moaned. They promised me. 15,000. Bumpy looked out at the room. He addressed the 85 witnesses. The Genovese family put a price on my head. $15,000. They tried to turn a father against his family. They thought they could buy my life with a check. He put a hand on Rosie's shoulder. But they forgot that in Harlem, we take care of our own, even the ones who lose their way. Bumpy pulled an envelope from his inside pocket and dropped it on the table in front of Rosie. There's $12,000 for the surgery, Rosie, and $3,000 for the recovery. Your daughter lives. Rosie looked at the money, then up at Bumpy, unable to speak. But you, Bumpy said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Rosie and I could hear. You are dead. You leave this restaurant. You leave Harlem. And you never come back. If I see your face north of 110th Street, I won't use poison. I'll use a hammer. Now get out. Rosie stood up. He took the envelope. He didn't look at anyone. He walked out of Sylvia's, a man who had been given his life back but had lost his soul. The room erupted. People were cheering. They thought Bumpy was a saint. They thought it was an act of mercy. But I knew better. Later that night, back at the brownstone, I asked him, "Why, Bumpy? Why give him the money? Why let him walk?" Bumpy was staring out the window at the streetlights. "Because, Frank, if I killed him, the Italians would just find another desperate man. They would think they almost got me. They would keep trying." He turned to me. "But now there is a man walking around out there who owes his daughter's life to me after he tried to kill me. That story will travel. The Italians will hear it, and they will know that they can't buy my people. They will know that even their spies belong to me." He lit a cigar and blew the smoke toward the ceiling. "Mercy is a weapon, Frank. Sometimes it cuts deeper than a knife. You kill a man. His suffering ends. You let him live with his shame, and he suffers forever." That was the lesson, and it was the moment I knew I had to go bigger. Bumpy controlled the kitchen, he controlled the restaurant, he controlled the block. But the poison still came from the Italians. The threat still came from outside. I realized that as long as we were buying from them, we were vulnerable. As long as there were middlemen, there would be leverage. I didn't just want to stop the poison. I wanted to own the well. I looked at Bumpy, the old lion, winning his chess games on 125th Street. And I decided right then and there, I wasn't going to play chess. I was going to change the game entirely. I was going to Southeast Asia. I was going to the Golden Triangle. I was going to cut out the Italians, cut out the middlemen, and build a pipeline so pure, so direct, that no one could ever leverage me again. Bumpy had his network of pharmacists and maids. I was going to build an army of generals and pilots. The conspiracy failed, but it opened my eyes. The garden always knows the snake. But if you own the jungle, the snakes work for you. You walk into Sylvia's on a Sunday afternoon in Harlem, and the air is so thick with the smell of fried chicken, collard greens, and expensive perfume that you can practically chew on it. It's the Vatican of Harlem, the high holy ground. If you are somebody, you are there. If you aren't there, you don't exist. March 17th, 1963, was no different. The tables were white linen, the silverware was heavy, and the room was packed with 85 of the most dangerous, influential, and compromised people in New York City. I was standing by the wall near the kitchen door, wearing a suit that cost more than the average man made in 2 years. I wasn't eating. I was watching. My eyes were scanning the room, checking the exits, checking the hands of the men at the corner tables. You had Councilman Dawkins wiping grease off his chin, laughing at a joke he didn't understand. You had the policy bankers, the men who ran the numbers game, huddled together like crows on a wire. You had a city inspector whose pockets were so full of bribe money he listed to the left when he walked. They were all there to pay tribute to the king, and Bumpy Johnson sat in the center of it all, calm as a frozen lake. To the untrained eye, it looked like a celebration. Bumpy had called for a brunch. He said it was time for Harlem to remember who we were. But I knew better. I knew that Bumpy Johnson didn't throw parties for the sake of nostalgia. He threw parties to set the record straight, and today the record was going to be written in something much thicker than ink. I watched the kitchen door swing open. Roosevelt Clemens walked out. He was carrying the silver percolator, the same pot he had brought from the brownstone, the same pot he believed was full of arsenic-laced coffee. Rosie looked like a man walking to the electric chair, but his legs hadn't gotten the memo to stop moving. He was wearing his Sunday best, but the collar was too tight, and I could see the sweat beading on his forehead even from 20 feet away. He was holding that pot with 2 hands, not out of reverence, but because if he let go with one, the shaking would give him away. The room didn't go quiet immediately. It took a moment. Bumpy stood up and the silence rippled out from his table like a wave. The clinking of forks stopped. The laughter died. The councilman put down his napkin. When Bumpy Johnson stands up, gravity shifts. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bumpy said. His voice wasn't loud, but it reached the back corners of the room without a microphone. "We talk a lot about business in this room. We talk about territory. We talk about power. But today I want to talk about loyalty." He paused, letting the word hang there. Loyalty. In our world, that word gets thrown around like loose change, but very few people know its actual weight. "This man," Bumpy said, gesturing to Rosie, who was now standing by the table, looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. "Roosevelt Clemens. He has fed me for 8 years. He knows how I like my eggs. He knows how I take my coffee. He is the first face I see in the morning and the last face I see at night. He is family." A few people clapped. Polite applause. They didn't know the script. They thought they were watching a retirement ceremony. I was watching an execution. Bumpy turned his head slowly and looked at Rosie. It was a look of absolute, terrifying affection. "Rosie," he said softly, "bring that pot here." Rosie took a step forward. The silver pot rattled against the saucer he was holding. "Pour me a cup," Bumpy commanded. Rosie poured. The dark liquid streamed out, hot and steaming. I watched the steam rise. I knew the chemistry of what was supposed to be in there. Arsenic is a cruel way to die. It tears the stomach lining. It shuts down the kidneys. It stops the heart. And Rosie believed with every fiber of his being that he was pouring death into the cup of the man who had saved him from the street. Bumpy picked up the saucer. He held the cup up to the light, inspecting it like a diamond cutter. Then, with a movement so smooth it was almost invisible, he slid the cup across the white tablecloth to the empty chair on his left. "Sit down, Rosie." The room was dead silent now. The air conditioner hummed. A fly buzzed against the window pane. Rosie stood there, frozen. I said, "Sit down." Rosie sat. He collapsed into the chair, his posture broken. Bumpy leaned in. He put both hands on the table. "You made this batch yourself, didn't you? This morning. Fresh. Just for me." "Yes, Mr. Johnson," Rosie whispered. His voice was a dry leaf stepping on concrete. "Good," Bumpy said. "Then you won't mind having a cup with me? Right here, in front of everyone." I saw Rosie's eyes dart around the room. He was looking for an exit, looking for a friend, looking for God. He found none of them. He looked at the councilman, who looked away. He looked at me, and I stared right through him. He was alone on an island, and the tide was coming in. "Mr. Johnson, Rosie started, his voice trembling. "Drink it," Bumpy said. The warmth was gone from his voice. It was steel now. 85 witnesses, Rosie. 85 people watching you refuse a cup of coffee you made with your own hands. What do you think that tells them?" Rosie looked at the cup. In his mind, that cup was a loaded gun. He had a choice. He could refuse and confess to the entire underworld that he was a traitor. Or he could drink and die in agony right there on the floor. He reached out. His hand was shaking so violently that coffee sloshed over the rim, staining the white linen brown. He lifted the cup to his lips. He closed his eyes. I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. He was bracing for the burn. He was bracing for the end. He tilted his head back and drank. He swallowed the entire cup in one go. He slammed the cup down and gripped the edge of the table, waiting. He was waiting for the fire in his gut. He was waiting for the convulsions. He squeezed his eyes shut, tears leaking out, waiting to die for $15,000. 1 minute passed. The room held its breath. 2 minutes. Rosie opened one eye, then the other. He touched his chest. He took a deep breath. He was still there. His heart was still beating. He looked at Bumpy, confusion warring with his terror. Bumpy didn't blink. He reached for the pot and poured Rosie another cup. "Drink another one," Bumpy said. Rosie drank. He drank it like water in a desert. He drank a third cup. He drained the pot. He sat there, alive, bewildered, the taste of bitter coffee on his tongue, realizing that something impossible had happened. Bumpy stood up. He loomed over the table. He picked up the empty cup and looked at the dregs. "It's bitters, Rosie," Bumpy said, his voice loud enough for the back row to hear. "Just bitters. I switched the pots 3 weeks ago, the day after I found out you sold me to the Italians." Rosie crumbled. It wasn't the poison that broke him. It was the revelation. The mask fell away. He put his face in his hands, and he wept. He sobbed like a child, loud, ugly, gasping sounds that echoed off the walls of the restaurant. "Lucille," he choked out. "My daughter, they promised me $15,000. I didn't have it, Mr. Johnson. I didn't have it." Bumpy looked out at the crowd. He addressed the room, turning his back on the weeping man. "The Genovese family put a contract on my life," Bumpy announced. $15,000. They found a man with a sick child, and they turned him into a weapon. They thought that because they have money, they have power. They thought they could come into my kitchen, into my home, and buy my death. He paused, looking at the councilmen, looking at the bankers. They were wrong, because in Harlem, nothing happens that I don't know about. The walls have ears, the streets have eyes, and the garden always knows the snake. Bumpy turned back to Rosie. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick white envelope. He dropped it on the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "There is $12,000 in there for the surgery at Johns Hopkins," Bumpy said, "and $3,000 for the recovery. Your daughter lives, Rosie." Rosie looked up, his face a wet mask of shock. He reached for the envelope, his fingers trembling, unable to comprehend the mercy. "But you," Bumpy said, and his voice dropped to a register that was colder than the grave. "You are dead. You leave this restaurant. You leave this borough. You go to Detroit. You go to Chicago. I don't care. But if I ever see your face north of 96th Street again, I won't use poison. I will cut you into pieces so small they won't be able to find you with a microscope. Now get out." Rosie stood up. He clutched the envelope to his chest like a shield. He stumbled away from the table, bumping into chairs, weaving through the silent crowd. He ran out the front door into the cold March afternoon, a man who had been given everything and lost everything in the same breath. The room erupted. The councilmen started clapping. The bankers cheered. They saw it as a divine act of benevolence. Bumpy Johnson, the saint of Harlem, forgiving the sinner. But I stood there, and I didn't clap. I was analyzing the move. I was looking at the board. Later that night I asked him. We were back at the brownstone. The real coffee was brewing. "Why, Bumpy?" I asked. "Why give him the money? Why let him walk? A bullet costs 10 cents. That envelope cost you 15 grand. Bumpy looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Frank," he said, "if I kill him, the Italians just find another desperate man. They think they almost got me. They think I'm vulnerable. But now Now there is a man walking around out there who owes his daughter's life to the man he tried to murder. That story will travel. The Italians will hear it. Carmine Persico will hear it, and they will know that they can't buy my people. They will know that even their spies belong to me. He took a sip of his coffee. Mercy is a weapon, Frank. If you use it right, it cuts deeper than any knife. You kill a man, his suffering ends. You let him live with his shame, and he suffers every day for the rest of his life. That is power. I nodded, but my mind was already moving past him. Bumpy was brilliant, yes. He was a master of the neighborhood game. But he was still playing defense. He was reacting to the Italians. He was reacting to their contracts, their supply, their rules. I looked at him, and I realized that I didn't want to be the man who survives the poison. I wanted to be the man who owns the water. Bumpy's way was the old way. It was dignified. It was respectful. But it was small. $15,000 to make a point? I was looking at a future where $15,000 was a rounding error. I was looking at a future where we didn't have to outsmart the Italians because we wouldn't even be in the same room as them. I was going to cut them out. I was going to go straight to the source. No middlemen, no diluted product, no contracts. Bumpy Johnson taught me how to handle a traitor without getting blood on my suit. But that night, as I watched the smoke rise from his cigar, I knew it was time for me to graduate. I wasn't going to wait for the snakes to come into my garden. I was going to pave the garden over and build a fortress. The era of Bumpy Johnson was ending. The era of the blue magic was about to begin. And I promised myself one thing. Nobody would ever get close enough to my coffee pot to make me wonder what was inside. Roosevelt Clemens walked out of Sylvia's restaurant at 2:47 that afternoon. He walked past the tables of Harlem's elite, past the councilmen wiping grease from their chins, past the policy bankers who suddenly found their shoes very interesting. He didn't look left. He didn't look right. He just clutched that envelope to his chest like it was the only thing keeping his heart beating. He walked out into the cold March air, a man who had kept his life but lost his shadow. The room stayed quiet for a long time. 85 people had just watched a man drink his own death and survive by the grace of a king. That changes the air in a room. It turns oxygen into reverence. 3 weeks later, Lucille Clemens checked into Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. The surgery cost $12,000. The recovery cost $3,000. It was paid in cash, anonymous donation. She came out of that hospital with a heart that ticked like a Swiss watch. She grew up, married a schoolteacher from Philadelphia, and lived to be 63 years old. She never knew that her life was purchased with a betrayal. She never knew the price of the blood in her veins. Rosie didn't fare as well. He took Bumpy's advice. He went to Detroit. He got a job in a diner near the Ford plant, flipping burgers for auto workers who didn't know his name and didn't care. He lived in a one-room walk-up with a hot plate and a window that looked out on a brick wall. Some nights, when the diner was empty and the coffee was brewing, I bet he stared at the percolator and remembered the taste of those bitters. The taste of a mercy he didn't deserve. As for the Italians, they got the message. That night, a courier delivered a note to the Genovese Social Club in Brooklyn. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was 3 words written in Bumpy's elegant handwriting. Send better snakes. Carmine Persico never tried to infiltrate Bumpy's household again. He realized that you can buy a man's greed, but you cannot buy a kingdom's loyalty. Bumpy Johnson went back to his routine the next morning. Fresh pot prepared by Juno Brown, drunk slowly while watching the sun rise over 127th Street. His kingdom, his streets, his rules. But I took a different lesson from that day. Bumpy showed me that mercy is a luxury for men who have already won. He played the game with dignity, with style. But I looked at that empty chair where Rosie had sat, and I realized something fundamental. Bumpy was playing defense. He was reacting to the Italians, reacting to the poison, reacting to the threat. I didn't want to react. I wanted to dictate. I realized that as long as we were buying from the middlemen, as long as we were dependent on their supply, We would always be vulnerable. Bumpy controlled the kitchen, but the Italians owned the grocery store. I decided right then that I wasn't going to be a king of Harlem. I was going to be a god of the supply chain. I was going to go to Southeast Asia, to the jungle, to the source. I wasn't going to wait for the snake to enter the garden. I was going to pave the garden over and build a fortress of blue magic. Respect wasn't given. It was earned. 1 kilo, 1 coffin, and 1 cup of coffee at a time. If you understand the difference between being a boss and being a leader, you know what to do. Smash that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we are just getting started. Turn on notifications because next time I'm going to tell you how I walked into the jungle with 100 grand in cash and walked out with the connection that changed the world. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were Bumpy? Would you have let Rosie walk or would you have put him in the ground? Real talk. I raid every single one. Until next time.